as a condition of gaining bail before trial. The government has kept possession of the firearms ever since then.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wilcox, did you or anyone in your organization communicate with the ATF?
About 3% of the sales. But we are talking about the 100% of a life being snuffed out.
Now, the DOJ could ask the appeals court for a special procedure that...
And they want to take all of the guns from some of the people, but it doesn't go far enough for them because it doesn't yet.
Breaking news, in New Mexico, because of a fabricated medical emergency, Michelle Luann Gishin violated the Constitution by revoking people's civil rights. U.S. Supreme Court strikes down New York's proper cause. The proper cause concealed carry statute in New York, which mandates that proper cause be established before obtaining a license to carry a weapon outside of one's home, has been declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. The ruling, which has been in place since 1911, represents the biggest expansion of gun rights in more than 10 years and throws into question laws governing concealed carry permits in 8 other states and the District of Columbia that are similar to those in New York. The law, which has been in force since 1911, was ruled illegal by the 6 conservative justices of the Supreme Court. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which guarantees everyone a right to equal treatment under the law, was allegedly violated by the New York statute, according to Justice Clarence Thomas, who authored the majority opinion in the case. The choice was made a few weeks ago, after mass slayings at a Buffalo, New York grocery store and a Uvalde, Texas primary school reignited national debates on gun control. The decision was promptly condemned by Democratic political figures who claimed it would jeopardize public safety. Governments should enact common-sense gun restrictions, said President Joe Biden, to protect their citizens and communities from gun violence. According to New York Governor Kathy Hochul, this decision isn't just careless, it's reprehensible. New York City Mayor Eric Adams said, "This decision has made every single one of us less safe from gun violence."
Mr. Henderson turned over his firearms to the FBI before he was convicted.
Thank you. Ms. Swear, let's revisit, is it the Rahimi case? Is that the right name?
It funds crisis intervention, including red flag laws. It keeps guns out of the hands of people who are a danger to themselves.
The Ninth and Fourth Circuits have said that, like other constitutional rights, all of them.
The action was brought by the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association and 2 of its members, Robert Nash and Brandon Koch, after their requests for licenses to carry concealed handguns for personal protection were turned down. The New York Supreme Court's Richard McNally ruled that neither man had sufficiently proven a necessity for self-defense to justify carrying a weapon in public. The plaintiffs then filed an appeal with a federal court in New York, challenging that denial. The case was dismissed by a federal court in New York, and the decision was upheld by the U.S. Second Circuit Court of Appeals. The U.S. Supreme Court then decided to hear the case. According to Thomas's majority judgment, the proper cause requirement, as it has been applied by state courts in New York, is in conflict with the history of firearm regulation in the nation. But according to Justice Stephen Breyer, the court can only conclude that New York's gun control laws are not compatible with the nation's historical history of firearm control, by ignoring the mountain of historical data that backs up such laws. Clarence Thomas, a judge, wrote the Bruin decision, which altered the legal environment for gun control laws and cast doubt on their effectiveness. According to the conservative majority, such regulations must take into account the historical background of the country. After the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals decided to overturn its first judgment in Rahimi's case and concur with the Supreme Court's decision, the offense for which Rahimi was accused was consequently deemed illegal in Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi. Rahimi had asked the Supreme Court to stay out of his case, claiming that since lower courts were still adjusting to the new legal norm created by the Bruin ruling, it would be premature for the justices to become involved.
So right now those restrictions are in place. Gun owners are not happy about it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to my friend.
No Democrat has ever tried to get anybody's guns. I mean, that's just a lie that they tell, and y'all ought to stop perpetuating the lie.
Time he was facing at least 1 felony domestic violence charge and 2 other.
And then ultimately, if the Supreme Court takes the case, the Supreme Court hears it in Washington.
Calling for a federal gun control, I should say.
As lower courts review handgun prohibitions that had previously been affirmed under intermediate scrutiny and deference to legislative judgment, in line with the Supreme Court's anticipated shift, many key cases are currently pending decisions. Choosing to hasten the procedure, the Justice Department argued that the law was both constitutional and necessary for lowering violence. They contended that Section 922G8 is consistent with a historical precedent that the government has disarmed people who are a threat to the safety of others. The department argued that the Fifth Circuit's opposite finding violated decisions made by previous appellate courts, misapplied Supreme Court principles, and created serious dangers to victims of domestic violence. The convergence of domestic violence restraining orders and Second Amendment rights is poised to be significantly affected by this next Supreme Court review, with potential ramifications for weapon restrictions across the country. According to the Supreme Court's new methodology, laws should only be considered constitutional if they are in some vaguely defined sense consistent with past precedent. The new demands are being swiftly met by a surge of legal actions brought by gun rights organizations and gun owners who contend that the new limits violate the Bruin decision of the Supreme Court. Federal courts have cited the June decision in their decisions as they negotiate the new legal landscape, many of which have stopped the implementation of the gun regulations. It is against the law in New Jersey to carry a firearm in public places like libraries, museums, bars, and restaurants. A federal district court judge stopped the enforcement of the sensitive place laws last month in response to legal challenges brought by gun owners and 4 gun organizations. Even while the legal fights in New Jersey and New York have involved new legislation that was approved in response to the court's ruling, the Supreme Court's new legal norm threatens federal statutes that were passed prior to the ruling. The gun rights standard of the Supreme Court faces legal difficulties and uncertainties. After determining that the law was unconstitutional in May, U.S. District Judge Joseph Goodwin dropped the case against a West Virginia man who was suspected of illegally possessing a firearm with a deleted serial number. According to a 3-judge panel in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, a 30-year-old federal law that prohibits someone under a domestic violence restraining order from possessing weapons is unconstitutional in light of the Bruin decision. Officials from the Justice Department intend to challenge the ruling, which could lead to a fresh hearing before the whole Fifth Circuit or a request for the Supreme Court to take the issue. The domestic abuse gun statute and other restrictions are now viewed as valid and even essential. The Bruin decision may pave the way for legal challenges to some gun control measures as well, even though there is bipartisan support for some of them, such as so-called red flag laws that allow courts to issue temporary orders allowing law enforcement to seize firearms from people who are deemed to be a threat to themselves or others. Applying the Bruin decision of the Supreme Court has been challenging, according to Esther Sanchez Gomez, litigation director for the Giffords Law Center, especially when deciding whether a weapon regulation is consistent with the nation's historical development. She thinks the new historical tradition standard, which asks district courts to act like historians in ways they aren't qualified to, has been difficult for them to apply. Judges have been urged to stop the enforcement of the legislation while the cases are being heard, since numerous legal proceedings involving new state gun prohibitions are still in the early stages. The Supreme Court's new legal criterion is difficult to implement, and recent rulings rejecting both new and old laws make state and federal efforts to enact stricter gun laws problematic. Politicians shouldn't be discouraged by the potential for legal conflicts, according to those who support tighter gun control laws.
James commented on the decision, saying she's pleased. Remember, the law as it stands strengthens requirements.
Did you speak to anyone personally?
I didn't.
To pass legislation that will do nothing to make Americans safer, but target our Second Amendment and our sacred God-given liberties.
That's correct.
So you were in communication with the Biden administration wanting to make these changes.
Controversial gun control measures in New Mexico spark legal and political controversy. Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham signed a historic executive order prohibiting citizens of Albuquerque and its surrounding suburbs from carrying firearms in public for the foreseeable future, following a succession of gun-related fatalities, including the slaying of an 11-year-old boy. The rule was swiftly assailed by prominent Republicans, and law enforcement authorities have cautioned that it might not be enforceable. A 30-day state of emergency was declared by Lujan Grisham's executive order, which also temporarily barred open and concealed carry of weapons in Bernalillo County, New Mexico, which encompasses the metropolis of Albuquerque, which has a population of over 560,000. Lujan Grisham said during the conference that she expects a legal challenge, but added that, showing a little courage, even when the clarity of that courage will be challenged, is worth the fight, contending that no constitutional right is intended to be absolute, and drawing parallels between the temporary ban and free speech restrictions. With Bernalillo County Sheriff John Allen warning that the order challenges the foundation of our Constitution, and Albuquerque Police Chief Harold Medina stating that the city's police department will not be held accountable for doing so, the order's legality and enforceability have already encountered difficulties. Republican politicians reacted swiftly to the criticism, including Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, a 2024 presidential contender, who declared, "Your Second Amendment rights shall not be infringed." Rep. Lauren Boebert also criticized the ban in a post on the social media site X, calling it flawed and asking if a governor felt like declaring an emergency right before an election, they'd be to suspend the 19th Amendment and stop women from voting. The ban, which is designated as a public health order and put into effect immediately, prohibits open and concealed carry on public property for 30 days, with certain exceptions, including for security guards and law enforcement officers. The maximum fine for infractions is $5,000. There are 38 states, including New Mexico, that allow open carry without a license. California, Florida, Illinois, New Jersey, and New York are the only 5 states where open carry is prohibited. However, with permission, open carry is permitted in Connecticut, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Rhode Island, and South Carolina.
Restrictions that New York passed on their statute about where you can have guns, places that don't have a sign.
A law that's unconstitutional. The judges panel ruled against this law that...
You know who cannot afford to wait? The single mom looking to protect herself and her children from a violent ex who has just been released from jail.
You cannot require that firearms in the home be, quote, rendered and kept inoperable.
Lou Jan Grisham said she expects a judicial challenge and said she is dubious of the legitimacy of one if it materializes. The order was the most recent attempt in the state to curtail gun violence, and it was also the one that raised the greatest questions over its ability to be enforced. The so-called red flag law, which permits state courts to temporarily seize firearms from people deemed to be dangerous to themselves or others, was signed by Lou Jan Grisham in 2020 after a group of rural sheriffs objected to the legislation, claiming it violated their constitutional rights to due process and the right to bear arms. In response, Lou Jan Grisham demanded the resignation of any police enforcement personnel who chose to disregard the law. $493 is a significant sum. There have been many mass slayings in the United States this year, according to data from the Gun Violence Archive, which keeps track of mass slayings in which 4 or more people are slayed or injured. More than 520 people were slayed in the accidents, according to the GVA. According to data from the anti-gun violence advocacy group Every Town for Gun Safety, there are 389 gun fatalities per year in New Mexico, or 18.3 fatalities for every 100,000 people, making the Land of Enchantment the 8th highest state in the nation for gun fatalities per capita. The rate of gun endings in the state grew by 43% between 2009 and 2018, according to Lou Jan Grisham's executive order, which is a far higher increase than the 18% increase during the same period nationwide. The bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which President Joe Biden signed into law last summer, reinforced gun control laws by, among other things, closing the infamous boyfriend loophole that let domestic abusers to possess firearms and designating gun trafficking as a federal offense. In recent years, Democratic politicians have pushed a series of proposals that would lessen gun violence in the U.S. Additionally, in March, President Joe Biden issued an executive order to impose stricter background checks on gun sellers. The executive order instructed federal agencies to develop strategies to prevent the sale of firearms by gun dealers whose licenses have been suspended, among other things. Other Democratic-led efforts to lower gun violence, however, have failed in Congress as a result of fervent Republican opposition. A bill to restrict assault rifles, which had previously passed in the House under Democratic leadership, failed in the Senate last year, owing to fierce opposition from Republicans who said the measure would violate their Second Amendment rights. Many conservatives have pushed for legislation that supports mental health and school safety in an effort to reduce gun violence. In March, Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy of California said, "We've got to deal with mental illness." Supreme Court bans Second Amendment for 30 days. The recent decision by New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham to temporarily ban concealed and open carry of weapons in the city of Albuquerque and Bernalillo County has sparked a substantial amount of debate and outrage in the state of New Mexico. The governor is compared to a tyrant wannabe by detractors, and their comparisons between her actions and those of the British monarchy are common. They contend that this action violates the rights guaranteed by the Second Amendment to residents of the impacted areas, and that it also establishes a precedent for the future that is cause for concern. The advocates for the right to bear arms argue that the prohibition, which was enforced in the midst of a crisis involving the public's health, is an unjustifiable use of power.
Crime for someone who's already been convicted of a felony to possess any firearm. Statute means what it says. It says that a convicted felon cannot possess a firearm.
Who needs to register as a federally licensed gun dealer and run background checks before selling a single weapon?
And no one contends otherwise. But what are the limits?
They contend that such actions could pave the way for additional intrusions into individual liberty during times of emergency, and they argue against taking such actions. Concerns have been raised over the possibility that other state governors would feel empowered to take similar acts in the event of future emergencies, such as the reappearance of COVID-19, if this decision is allowed to stand without being challenged. As a reaction to the ban, a number of law enforcement authorities, such as the Chief of Police of Albuquerque, Harold Medina, and the Sheriff of Bernalillo County, John Allen, have chosen not to enforce it. They are of the opinion that the ban infringes upon the fundamental constitutional rights of citizens, and as a result, they have opted not to engage in its implementation. Law enforcement organizations and personnel are being urged by those who are opposed to the actions taken by the governor to take into consideration the historical background and ramifications of the ban. They argue that it is vital for law enforcement to be informed of the potential repercussions of supporting such restrictions on the right to bear arms, and that this knowledge should be communicated to law enforcement officials. In conclusion, this contentious decision made by Governor Lujan Grisham has prompted a heated debate about the appropriate balance to be struck between protecting the general public and protecting individual rights in times of emergency. It continues to be a source of major concern and conversation among residents of the affected communities, as well as law enforcement officials in those areas. Concerns over unconstitutional actions in New Mexico. This is blatantly unconstitutional and criminal. In fact, just one of the federal laws that this woman violated was a deprivation of rights under the color of law. It's a civil rights violation. It's not just one count. She should receive as many counts of violating this law as there are Albuquerque residents, as well as those who live in Burnett County. She's a criminal. Something of this size has never occurred in American history, and simply trying to impeach, trying to sue, getting on the news and saying it's horrible, talking about it on Twitter or Facebook, or even posting about it on YouTube is not enough. One incident that happened that was close was what the New Orleans Police Department did after Hurricane Katrina in seizing firearms from people. Why? Because of tyranny. Why did this happen in New Mexico? Because of tyranny. Even David Hogg came out and said this was unconstitutional, and that says something. Where is the Department of Justice? Where are they?
The families who, in fact, were victimized by the gun shooting that we've seen.
Since it offers a strong moral check against the usurpation and arbitrary power of rulers.
And that's why gun owners wanted the Supreme Court to put the statute on hold. They have now said no.
Let's see what is the most compelling thing to learn from that case. How many times was this gentleman...
A day for the most significant law to be passed since then, for the last 30 years.
Keeps people with domestic violence restraining orders from possessing a firearm.
They have a sitting governor who has removed or attempted to. She doesn't have the power to do this, and we'll get to that in a minute. But her fiat has, in her mind, removed a constitutional right for feelings, and that's not how it works. Where is the Department of Justice? Why have they not taken her into custody? Why hasn't the President of the United States come out against a sitting governor who has suspended what this country stands for? Where are they? That kind of lets you know what the plan is. Where are the local district attorneys? The one in Albuquerque yesterday came out and said, we're not prosecuting any of these violations. The local state, the local chief of police in Albuquerque, we're not following this. The local sheriff, we're not following this. Well, they don't want to be sued personally, but they know this is unconstitutional. Where is a district attorney in that state? Where is one of them with the stones to stand for the rights of all citizens in that state? Where are they? All it takes is one. One district attorney has enough intestinal fortitude to do what his job demands or her job demands and to file charges and arrest the governor. Now, the governor said that it'll be on the state police to enforce this because obviously the sheriff and the chief of police for the city have said, we're not doing this. If any troopers have the balls to try to lock up an American who's following their law and carrying openly or concealed under this executive fiat, they should be arrested too by the chief of police in Albuquerque or the sheriff of Bernalillo County. A call for courageous action. Let's draw the line here. All we need is a sheriff with the guts to arrest the governor. Political futures be damned. We have a sheriff who refused to prosecute anyone or enforce the law because of financial reasons, even though it was a constitutional violation. We need only one person with stones, just one. That's all it takes, and more will follow. You will have support in this country, regardless of our history or where we can become as a sheriff, and if that can lead to a political career. 2 lawsuits have been filed by national groups against the governor, as reported. The first lawsuit was filed by the National Association of Gun Rights, but details of the filing are not available. Additionally, the Attorneys of Gun Owners of America filed a lawsuit on the same matter. A brief excerpt of their lawsuit will be presented here. Further conversations were held with other attorneys, and there are plans to provide additional updates on this issue. On the screen now is the lawsuit that was filed by Gun Owners of America and Gun Owners Foundation, and we'll read you just the beginning of the complaint. Purporting to respond to recently declared statewide public health emergencies of gun violence and drug abuse in New Mexico, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham and the Department of Health Secretary Patrick M. Allen have asserted the unilateral power to suspend constitutional rights and impose what is essentially martial law. To that end, they have promulgated an executive order signed by the governor on September 7, 2023, and thereafter a public health emergency order signed by the secretary on September 8, 2023, that flatly eliminates the right to bear arms in public in various cities or counties within the state.
Saying you can bring a gun in here, you can't go into with a gun.
Tyrants disarm the people they intend to oppress. Those are the facts.
You know, I'm about to sign into law bipartisan gun safety legislation.
The Second Amendment protections apply to 18 to 20-year-olds.
So the third party can either keep them in trust or sell them and give the money to Mr. Henderson.
In a place at the time of the Constitution's framing.
And meets a convoluted multi-part test for levels of criminal activity. Aware that local authorities have publicly announced that they are unwilling to enforce this clearly unconstitutional edict and have staunchly refused to participate in the defendant's scheme to deprive their constituents of their constitutional rights, the defendants have ordered the New Mexico State Police to act as a private army of stormtroopers to be sent en masse to enforce the defendant's open and notorious subversion of constitutional rights. There is no defense to the defendant's actions, legal, moral, or otherwise. Their actions clearly and unambiguously violate the Second Amendment's protection of the right to bear arms that shall not be infringed and deprive law-abiding gun owners of their only means of self-defense from criminal attack while in public. For that reason, this court must end this unconstitutional charade before the train even leaves the station. To that end, plaintiffs request an immediate temporary restraining order to be issued on an emergency basis, followed by a preliminary and then permanent injunction, and also seek declaratory or other relief. Moreover, because there is literally nothing that the defendants can offer as a legal defense to their blatant and egregious constitutional violations. Lawsuit and urgent call to action. The other filing by Nager has not been read, and it may be reviewed today, depending on the circumstances. The lawsuit being referred to in this context requests the issuance of a restraining order ex parte, without granting the defendants an opportunity to respond or be heard. This implies that there is a belief that the defendants have no valid defense that would justify their actions. In the event that a sheriff were to carry out the arrest of a U.S. citizen for exercising a right guaranteed to them since birth, it is suggested that such sheriffs should also be subject to legal consequences. It is expressed that the individuals involved in such actions are wished the best during their time in jail until any future encounters. A plea is made to the residents of Albuquerque to refrain from obeying what is considered an unconstitutional order. It is advised that they stay vigilant and exercise their right to bear arms for self-protection and the protection of their community.
Those laws will still be in effect until first the Court of Appeals hears it in New York.
It's repeated over and over again that the Second Amendment is unlimited.
Implemented by states My administration is going to focus on how they administer it and whether or not they violate other laws.
We have a Second Amendment because we understand in this country that there are some things, inalienable rights.
This right is emphasized as a cornerstone of the nation. A warning is issued against jeopardizing personal safety by complying with the governor's orders and potentially allowing criminals to exploit the situation. The message underscores the importance of not becoming victims due to the governor's actions. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.